Hello, everyone. I know many of you come here to relax, unwind, and maybe even drift off to sleep while listening to these stories. But before you do, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. _, do you ever wonder what hides in the darkness when you think you're all alone? _. When I was 21, I lived at home with my parents. Our house was beautiful, nestled on a large plot of land that backed onto a small pond. We had a huge backyard that stretched right to the water's edge, and beyond the pond was a small town park. The neighborhood was upscale, and the houses were spaced far apart, which gave us privacy. My parents had multiple homes, so they were often away, leaving me home alone a lot. It was summer, and the heat was just beginning to fade as the sun dipped below the horizon. I had the house to myself, and I loved it that way. There was something peaceful about the quiet stillness of the place, with only the sound of the breeze rustling through the trees and the occasional splash from the pond to remind me that the world was still moving. That evening, I was curled up in the sunroom, my favorite room in the house, watching TV. The sunroom had wide windows that gave a full view of the backyard and the pond, and in the summertime, the breeze that flowed through made it the perfect place to relax. I was completely engrossed in my show when I heard something that made me pause. Splash. At first, I ignored it. Living near the pond, I was used to the occasional splash from a bird or a fish jumping out of the water. But then the noise came again, louder this time, more insistent. Splash. Splash. I turned down the volume on the TV, listening carefully. This wasn't the soft splash of a fish. It was heavier, almost like someone or something was thrashing in the water. My heart began to race. It couldn't be an animal. It sounded too big, too forceful. I got up from the couch, my feet sinking into the plush carpet as I made my way to the door leading to the deck. The evening air was warm as I stepped outside, the faint chirping of crickets filling the silence. I squinted into the darkness, looking toward the pond. At first, I couldn't see anything. The moonlight cast a soft glow over the water, but it wasn't enough to make out what was causing the noise. And then I saw a figure in the water. It was a man. He was in the middle of the pond, his head barely visible above the waterline, and he was humming. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a low, tuneless melody that sent a chill down my spine. I stood frozen, staring at the figure, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why was he in our pond? Was he one of the neighbors? I took a step back, suddenly feeling very exposed standing out on the deck. The man in the water didn't seem to notice me at first. He was too focused on whatever he was doing, his arms moving slowly through the water as he hummed. And then, as if sensing my presence, he stopped. The humming ceased, and for a moment, everything was deathly silent. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The man turned his head slightly, and I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see his face clearly. Panic surged through me. I rushed back inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone and texted my older brother, Jake, who was away at college. "There's someone in the pond," I typed, my fingers shaking. "I don't know who it is, but they're just there." I stared at the screen, waiting for a response, but Jake didn't answer right away. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity, as I paced the sunroom, glancing out the windows to see if the man was still there. Finally, my phone buzzed. "Probably one of the neighbors messing around," Jake replied. "Don't worry about it. Just lock up and stay inside." That wasn't comforting. I had never seen any of the neighbors swim in the pond before, and something about the way the man had been staring at me felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a harmless prank. I tried to distract myself by turning the TV back on, but I couldn't focus on the show anymore. My mind kept wandering back to the man in the pond. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there watching me. And then I heard it. Breathing. Aim calm. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more labored. It was coming from outside the window. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the sound, my eyes widening in fear. I couldn't see anything through the glass, just the dark outline of the backyard. But the breathing continued, heavy and deliberate, like someone was standing just outside watching me. I dropped to the floor, pressing myself flat against the couch, my pulse racing. My mind screamed at me to hide, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And then, through the silence, I heard a voice. "I see you." The words were low, almost a growl, and they came from just outside the window. My blood ran cold. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that I was imagining things, but the voice had been so clear, so close. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I confront whoever was out there? Every option felt dangerous, like it could escalate the situation. After what felt like an eternity, I finally worked up the courage to peek over the edge of the couch. My eyes darted to the window, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just darkness. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. Maybe it had been a trick of my imagination. Maybe the stress of being home alone had made me hear things. But as I stood up, my legs still trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, the sun rose like any other day, casting its golden light over the backyard and the pond. But something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. I stepped outside onto the deck, my feet making soft thuds on the wood as I walked toward the edge of the pond. The water was calm, the surface reflecting the blue sky above. There was no sign of the man from the night before. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They were wet, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the pond, up the stairs of the deck, and right to the window where I had heard the breathing. My blood ran cold as I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints were barefoot, the outline of each toe clearly visible in the drying mud. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the deck. Whoever had been in the pond last night had been right outside my window, watching me, breathing. I didn't wait around to see if they would come back. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. They came quickly, searching the backyard and the area around the pond, but they didn't find anything. No sign of the man. No clues as to who he was or why he had been there. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. The man from the pond was real. Intriguing. What would you do if someone or something was watching you from the darkness? What would you do if a voice in the darkness called out for help, but something about it was terribly wrong? It was late, later than I probably should have been out, but this was my routine. Every night, without fail, I took my dog for his final walk of the day. It was a habit I developed over the years, and though most people wouldn't feel comfortable going out so late, it never bothered me. I lived in a quiet condominium complex, and the cul-de-sac where I walked was always deserted by that time of night. It was peaceful in its own way, just me and my dog, the world falling silent around us as we strolled through the dimly lit streets. I usually had my headphones in, one earbud tucked in to listen to music, the other free in case I needed to be aware of my surroundings. It was a routine that had never given me any reason to feel uneasy. Until one night. 8. It started like any other evening. I grabbed my dog's leash, and we set off on our usual route, walking down the driveway that led out to the cul-de-sac parking lot. The lot was always empty at this time, just a few cars parked in the spots belonging to the nearby residents. There were no streetlights in the lot, but I carried a small flashlight with me, shining it ahead as we walked. The first sign that something was wrong was the voice. At first, I didn't even register it. I was too lost in the music, too focused on the rhythm of the song playing in my ear. But then it came again, a faint, distant sound, barely audible over the music. A voice. I stopped, pulling out my earbud and standing still, listening. The night was silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a cricket. But then, there it was again, a voice, calling out from somewhere ahead of me. Help. The word was muffled, as if it was being spoken through something, but it was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, my flashlight sweeping across the empty parking lot, but there was no one there, just the parked cars, dark and silent in the night. Help. It came again, a little louder this time, and it sent a chill down my spine. The voice was coming from the direction of the parked cars, but I couldn't see anyone. My dog hadn't reacted to the sound, still sniffing around the bushes nearby, oblivious to the voice that seemed to be calling out for help. I hesitated. My instincts told me to turn around, to go back home and forget about it. But what if someone really needed help? What if there was a child or a woman in trouble, trapped somewhere I couldn't see? Against my better judgment, I took a few cautious steps forward, my flashlight still pointed ahead. The voice came again, softer this time, but closer. Help! It didn't sound right. There was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the muffled quality of the voice, it was the tone. The word was spoken the same way each time, with no variation in emotion, no desperation or urgency. It was flat, almost robotic. I stopped again, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't right. There was no one in sight, no one who could be calling for help. And yet the voice continued, repeating the same word over and over again, as if it was stuck on a loop. Help. The sound was coming from my left now, near a row of parked cars. I shone my flashlight in that direction, my fingers trembling slightly as I stepped closer. I could see the cars all lined up in neat rows: SUVs, sedans, and a couple of trucks, but no sign of a person. The voice continued, muffled and monotonous, each repetition making my stomach churn with unease. I wasn't imagining this. I knew I wasn't, but something was terribly wrong. My dog's ears perked up suddenly, and he looked in the same direction I was facing, his body tensing. He hadn't reacted to the voice before, but now he seemed to sense that something was off. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and I could see the unease in his posture. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I didn't know what to do. Should I check the cars? Should I call the police? My mind raced through 100 different possibilities, each one worse than the last. Then, the voice changed. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in tone, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The word help was still being repeated, but now it sounded wrong. The pitch was off, like someone or something was imitating a human voice, but didn't quite know how to get it right. My dog growled softly, his body rigid as he stared at the row of cars. He wasn't barking, just growling, low and threatening, as if warning me that whatever was making that sound wasn't human. I took a step back, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. This wasn't a person in need of help. This wasn't something I could explain away as a prank or a misunderstanding. Something was hiding in the darkness, something that wanted me to come closer. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a surge of panic as the light dimmed. I tapped it, willing it to stay on, but the beam wavered, casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. The voice continued, more distorted now, more unnatural. Help. I turned, pulling my dog's leash and walking quickly back toward the driveway. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to get as far away from that voice as possible. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see whatever was lurking behind those cars. As we neared the driveway, I heard the voice again, but this time it was louder, closer, like it had followed me. Help. I broke into a run, my dog keeping pace beside me as we fled back to the safety of the condo. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the night, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me, suffocating me. When we finally reached the front door of the condo, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took several tries to unlock the door. I shoved it open, pulling my dog inside, and slammed it shut behind me, locking every bolt and latch. For a long time, I just stood there, my back pressed against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. The house was silent, save for the sound of my dog panting beside me. I didn't hear the voice anymore. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I woke up with the uneasy memory of the night before still lingering in my mind. I had barely slept, my thoughts consumed by the eerie voice and the sense of dread that had settled over me. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it had to be some kind of prank or maybe a recording someone had left playing in the parking lot. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had been too strange, too unnatural. I went about my day, trying to focus on work and other tasks, but the feeling of unease never left me. Every time I thought about the voice, my skin crawled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to hear it again. That night, as the sun began to set, I felt a growing sense of dread. I didn't want to go out for the walk, but my dog needed it. I couldn't avoid it forever. With a heavy heart, I grabbed his leash and stepped outside, my flashlight in hand. The air was cool, and the sky was darkening, casting long shadows across the parking lot as we made our way down the driveway. The lot was empty, just like the night before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground ahead of me, my dog walking close by my side. We reached the parking lot, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. There were no strange noises, no eerie voices calling out in the darkness, just the quiet hum of the night and the soft sound of my footsteps on the pavement. But then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again. Help. It was fainter this time, almost a whisper, but it was the same voice, the same unnerving tone. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the parking lot. There was no one there. The voice came again, this time from behind me. Help. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The parking lot was still empty, the cars lined up in neat rows, but the voice was closer now, more insistent. My dog growled, his hackles raised as he stared at the row of cars. He could sense it too, that something was wrong, that something wasn't right about the voice. I didn't wait this time. I turned and ran, pulling my dog with me as we fled back to the condo. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear and confusion. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it tightly, just as I had the night before. I stood there, breathing hard, my body trembling with adrenaline. The voice didn't follow me this time, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't go for another walk after that. I couldn't bring myself to face the parking lot again, not after what I had heard. I called the condo association, asking if anyone else had reported strange noises or voices in the parking lot, but no one had. They chalked it up to stress or exhaustion, but I knew better. I still hear the voice sometimes late at night when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long. It calls out from the darkness, repeating the same word over and over again like a broken record. Help. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's a person, a spirit, or something far worse. But I know one thing for certain. Whatever is out there, whatever is calling out for help, it's not human. When a cry for help comes from the darkness, can you trust what you hear? When your safe space becomes the target of something unknown, how long can you convince yourself it's just your imagination? When I was 10 years old, my family lived in a house that was nestled deep in the woods, far from the main road. It had always been my home, but it was the kind of house that, to a kid my age, felt more like a maze of shadows and creaking floorboards than a place of comfort. The tall trees around the house added to the isolation, making the house feel like it was cut off from the rest of the world. My bedroom was in the far corner of the house, with two large windows that faced out into the dark woods. On most nights, the only sounds I could hear were the faint rustling of the wind through the trees or the occasional hoot of an owl. But that sense of peace started to unravel the year I turned 10. I had a nightlight, a small one that I kept on every night without fail. It was my security against the darkness that I still feared. The nightlight had different color settings, and I always kept it on red. It was a habit that I didn't even think about. The red light was soothing, helping me drift off to sleep without fear of the shadows creeping in from the woods. One night, I woke up for no apparent reason. I was groggy, my head heavy with sleep, but something felt different. The room was darker than usual. It took me a moment to realize that the red glow from my nightlight was gone. Instead, it had shifted to blue, casting an eerie hue over my room. I stared at the nightlight for a few seconds, confused. I knew I had set it to red before falling asleep, like I did every night. I rubbed my eyes, chalking it up to a glitch, or maybe I had accidentally changed the setting while shifting in bed. Still, it unsettled me. I changed the light back to red, rolled over, and forced myself to go back to sleep. But the next night, it happened again. This time I woke up in the middle of the night to find the nightlight set to green. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't touched the light after going to bed, and I was sure I had left it on red. I told my parents about it the next morning, expecting them to take me seriously. Instead, they shrugged it off. My dad said the nightlight was probably faulty, and my mom told me to stop worrying about such silly things. I was frustrated, but I had no choice but to accept their explanation. Maybe it was a glitch, just like they said. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening. The next few nights passed without incident, and I started to relax, thinking it was just a one-time fluke. That sense of peace didn't last long. A week later, I woke up again in the dead of night. My eyes snapped open, and my room was bathed in complete darkness. The nightlight was off, not just changed to a different color, completely off. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as I stared at the darkened corner of the room where the nightlight should have been glowing. My breath hitched in my throat as I leaned over the side of my bed and found the nightlight lying on the floor, unplugged. I froze, fear coursing through me. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gotten out of bed since falling asleep. So how had the nightlight been unplugged? I wanted to run to my parents' room, but I was too scared to move. My body felt like it was glued to the bed, my mind racing with all the terrifying possibilities of what could have happened. I stayed awake the rest of the night, watching the darkness, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I told my parents again. My dad rolled his eyes, saying I was too old to be using a nightlight anyway. My mom offered a little more sympathy, but even she seemed to think I was overreacting. But I knew something wasn't right. The next night, the nightlight was back in its place, plugged in and set to red. I stared at it for a long time before falling asleep, my nerves on edge, half expecting it to flicker off the moment I closed my eyes. And then, just like before, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, I didn't immediately notice the nightlight. Instead, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from my closet. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to listen. It was so quiet, so subtle, that I thought maybe I was imagining it. But then it came again, a soft shuffling, like something was moving inside the closet, brushing against the clothes hanging inside. Fear gripped me. My closet was across the room, its door slightly ajar. I couldn't see inside, but I could feel something watching me from within. My skin prickled with dread as the rustling continued, low and constant. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but my voice was trapped in my throat. I lay there, frozen, listening to the sound, my mind racing with images of what could be hiding in my closet. Finally, after what felt like hours, the rustling stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I told my parents again, but they didn't believe me. My dad even went so far as to check the closet, but of course there was nothing inside, just clothes, old toys, and posters. Nothing out of the ordinary. They didn't understand. They couldn't hear what I had heard. They couldn't feel the way the air had changed in my room, how the shadows seemed darker, heavier. The following nights were the worst of my life. Every night, like clockwork, I would wake up to that rustling sound in the closet. It would start slow, barely audible, but then it would grow louder, more insistent, as if something was moving around in there, trying to get out. I stopped sleeping entirely. Every time I heard the sound, I would lie there, wide-eyed, clutching my blanket as if it could protect me from whatever was lurking in the darkness. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. On the fourth night, I reached my breaking point. The rustling had woken me again, and I was so tired, so terrified, that I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the covers, leaped out of bed, and ran to my parents' room, tears streaming down my face as I begged them to believe me. My dad was furious. He dragged me back to my room, his face red with anger as he yanked open the closet door, ready to prove once and for all that there was nothing inside. But that's when he found it. Behind one of my posters, there was a hole in the wall, not a small one, but a gaping, dark hole that led somewhere deep into the house. My mom screamed, and my dad stood frozen, staring at the hole in disbelief. It was too deep to see where it led, but it was clear that something or someone had been using it to come into my room. My dad ran outside, checking the perimeter of the house. He found a small opening at the base of the house, covered in dirt and leaves. It led directly into the hole in my closet. That was the last night we ever spent in that house. My mom packed us up and we went to stay with my aunt until we could move. My parents were shaken, though they never talked about it again. I think they felt guilty for not believing me, for dismissing my fears as childish imagination. But I knew the truth. Something had been coming into my room every night. Something had been watching me, listening to me as I lay awake, terrified in the dark. I'll never know who or what it was, and maybe that's for the best. But the memory of those nights, of the rustling in the closet and the hole in the wall, still haunts me to this day. What would you do if something was watching you while you slept, and no one believed you? After we moved, I stopped needing a nightlight, not because I wasn't scared anymore, but because I couldn't stand the idea of having one. The darkness felt safer now, less deceptive than the soft glow of a nightlight that could change without warning. For a long time, I didn't talk about what had happened in that house. My parents seemed eager to forget about it, to move on as if the hole in the wall had never existed. We didn't bring any of our old furniture or belongings with us, not even the nightlight. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that room. I think about the rustling sound, about the dark hole behind the poster, and about what or who might have been coming through it. I've read about people living in the walls of houses, hiding out in secret spaces where they can go unnoticed for months, even years. They slip in and out when the owners are away, stealing food, clothing, and anything else they need to survive. It's rare, but it happens. Was that what had been happening to me? Had someone been living in our walls, watching me sleep, moving around in my closet at night? The thought sends chills down my spine, even now. But there's another possibility, one that I try not to think about. What if it wasn't a person at all? What if something else had been using that hole? Something that didn't belong in this world, something that had found its way into my room through the cracks and crevices of the house. I'll never know for sure, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing I do know is this: I'll never take the safety of my room for granted again. No matter where I live, no matter how secure the house seems, I'll always remember that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are very real. And sometimes they're closer than you think. How do you sleep knowing that the things that haunt your nightmares might be more real than you imagined? What would you do if the wind carried voices from a place no one dared to go? When I was young, my family moved to a small town tucked away in the countryside. Our new house was modest, nestled at the edge of a forest that stretched for miles. I had always been fascinated by nature, so the idea of having a sprawling forest as my backyard was a dream come true. The town itself was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and life moved at a slower pace. But there was one thing about the town that didn't sit right with me. Near the edge of the forest, where the trees grew thick and ancient, there stood an old oak tree. It was massive, its branches stretching out like the gnarled arms of a giant, casting a long shadow over the clearing below. The locals called it the Whispering Tree, and from the moment I first saw it, I knew there was something strange about it. I remember asking my parents about the tree, but they brushed off my questions, saying it was just an old tree and nothing to worry about. But when I asked some of the kids at school, they gave me a different answer. "You shouldn't go near it," one of the boys told me, his voice low and serious. "The Whispering Tree is cursed." I laughed it off at first, thinking he was just trying to scare me. But as I spent more time in the town, I started hearing more and more stories about the tree. Everyone seemed to have their own version of what made it so eerie. But the one thing they all agreed on was this: you didn't go near the tree after dark. According to the legend, The tree had once been the site of something terrible, something the townspeople refused to talk about. Some said a family had been hanged there generations ago, accused of witchcraft. Others claimed it was a place where people went to disappear, swallowed by the shadows of the forest, never to be seen again. Whatever the truth was, the tree had gained a reputation as a place of bad luck, a place where whispers carried on the wind, calling out to those who ventured too close. Despite the warnings, I was curious. I had always been a skeptic, and the idea that a tree could be cursed seemed ridiculous. So one afternoon, I decided to go see the whispering tree for myself. I waited until the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was cool, and the breeze rustled the leaves as I made my way through the woods. The path to the tree wasn't hard to find. It was as if the forest itself had carved a path leading straight to it. When I reached the clearing, I stopped. There it was, the whispering tree, standing tall and ominous at the center of the open space. The stories didn't do it justice. Up close, the tree was massive, its bark rough and cracked, with thick roots twisting out of the ground like the claws of a beast. The branches above me creaked and groaned, swaying in the wind, but the forest around me was eerily silent. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to step closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the base of the tree. I told myself it was just a tree, nothing more. There was no reason to be afraid. But as I stood there, staring up at the gnarled branches, I felt something strange. It was as if the air around me had changed, growing heavier, thicker. The breeze that had been blowing gently through the forest was now gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I shivered, suddenly feeling cold, despite the warmth of the evening. And then I heard it. A whisper. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, soft, distant, but unmistakable. Help. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The whisper was coming from the tree. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone hiding nearby, but I was alone. The clearing was empty and the forest beyond was silent. No birds, no animals, no rustling leaves. Just the soft whisper of a voice carried on the wind. Help me. The voice was louder now, clearer. It sounded like a woman's voice, desperate and pleading. My throat tightened as I took a step back, my pulse quickening. This wasn't possible. Trees didn't talk. Voices didn't come from nowhere. But as I stood there, the whispering continued, growing more insistent. Please, help me. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from the tree as possible, but I couldn't move. It was as if the voice was holding me in place, drawing me closer, pulling me in. I didn't want to believe it, but I could feel it in my bones. There was something trapped inside that tree, something that needed help. Suddenly, the wind picked up, and the branches above me swayed violently. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate plea. Don't leave me. Please, don't leave. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice was so real, so full of pain and fear, that it sent a wave of nausea through me. I turned and ran, tearing through the forest, not stopping until I was back in my yard, gasping for breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice kept replaying in my mind, the soft, desperate whispers echoing in the silence of my room. I wanted to believe it had been my imagination, that I had let the stories get to me, but I knew better. Something was wrong with that tree. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They listened, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. My dad shook his head, telling me that I was just spooked by the local legends. My mom suggested I stay away from the woods for a while, just to be safe. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The voice, the way it had begged for help, it felt too real to ignore. I needed answers. I started asking around, trying to learn more about the tree and the stories surrounding it. Most people were reluctant to talk about it, brushing off my questions or changing the subject. But there was one person who seemed to know more than the others. Miss Evans, an elderly woman who had lived in the town her whole life. was sitting on her porch when I approached her. She had a reputation for being a bit of a recluse, but I had seen her around town enough to know she wasn't unfriendly. I figured if anyone knew the truth about the whispering tree, it would be her. When I asked her about it, she gave me a long, hard look before speaking. "You've been to the tree, haven't you?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I figured someone like you would be curious enough to go there. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Miss Evans glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening, before continuing. "That tree, it's old. Older than the town itself. There's a reason people avoid it, a reason the stories never seem to die." I leaned in, hanging on her every word. "Years ago," she said, her voice low, "back when the town was first settled, there was a family that lived out near the woods. The father was a cruel man, violent and angry, and he took it out on his wife and children. One night, in a fit of rage, he killed them all. His wife, his 2 daughters, he buried their bodies under that tree." I stared at her, horrified. "But that's not the worst part," she continued. "The townspeople found out what he'd done, and they took him into the woods. They hanged him from the branches of that tree, and they left his body there for the crows." I shivered, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Ever since then, Miss Evans said, people have heard whispers coming from the tree. They say it's the souls of his wife and daughters trapped there calling out for help, but no one can help them. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "But why did I hear it? Why now?" She shook her head. "I don't know, but the tree has a way of finding people. Once you hear the whispers, it's hard to ignore them." I left her porch with a heavy heart, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The idea that the tree was cursed, that the souls of the family were trapped there, was too much for me to wrap my head around. But I couldn't deny what I had heard. The whispering was real. For days, I avoided the woods, trying to forget what had happened. But the voice haunted me, echoing in the back of my mind no matter how hard I tried to block it out. Every time the wind blew, I thought I could hear the faint whisper of a woman's voice, pleading for help. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep. The whispers grew louder in my mind, more insistent, as if they were following me, even in my dreams. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. One evening, just before sunset, I returned to the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the weight of something unseen. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the tree, the familiar feeling of dread creeping over me. The whispers started almost immediately. "Help me." The voice was louder this time, more desperate, as if it had been waiting for me. I stood there, staring up at the tree, unsure of what to do. The branches above me swayed in the wind, creaking and groaning like they were alive. "Please, don't leave me." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. I didn't know how to help. I didn't even know if I could, but I couldn't just walk away, not after everything I had heard. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know how to help you." The whispering stopped. For a moment, the clearing was completely silent. The wind died down and the branches above me stilled. I waited, half expecting the voice to return, but it didn't. Then, without warning, a gust of wind rushed through the clearing, shaking the branches violently. I stumbled back, shielding my face as leaves and twigs flew through the air. And then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The forest was quiet again, the air still, but something was different. The weight that had hung over the clearing, the feeling of being watched, was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tree, waiting for the whispers to return, but they didn't. The tree was silent. I don't know what happened that day, or why the whispers stopped. Maybe I had finally given the spirits the acknowledgement they needed, Or maybe the tree had simply chosen to let me go. Either way, I never went back to the whispering tree after that. Some things are better left alone. When the past calls out from the shadows, will you be able to turn away? What would you do if something dark and uninvited began watching you from the safety of your own home? I had always felt safe in my room. It was my sanctuary, my space where the world outside couldn't touch me. But that sense of safety was shattered one night when I saw something that I can never forget. It started innocently enough. I had just finished high school, and like most teenagers, I spent a lot of time in my room, either doing homework, watching movies, or talking to friends. My bedroom was on the second floor, with a large window that overlooked our quiet suburban street. I loved that window. During the day, sunlight poured through, filling my room with warmth, and at night, I could gaze out and see the stars. But that window, the one I had always loved, became the source of my greatest fear. One evening, as I sat at my desk finishing up a homework assignment, I heard a noise from outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint tapping sound like something lightly hitting the window. I glanced up, but the street outside was dark and still. The lamppost at the corner of the street flickered, casting an eerie glow over the sidewalk, but nothing seemed out of place. I figured it was probably just a tree branch brushing against the window. There were plenty of tall trees in our yard, and the wind often made the branches scratch the side of the house. I went back to my homework, not thinking much of it, but the tapping continued. This time, it was more insistent, louder than before. I turned toward the window, frowning. The sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the glass itself, like someone was gently knocking on it. My heart skipped a beat. The idea of someone being outside my window was absurd. My room was on the second floor, and there was no way anyone could be up there without a ladder. I tried to ignore the sound, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I was overtired from studying. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a bird or something flying past the window. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow caused by the light outside. It was a figure vague, dark, and human-shaped, standing right outside my window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to notice it. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly stood up from my desk. I took a step closer to the window, my pulse racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure remained still, its form hazy and indistinct in the dim light, but it was definitely there standing outside, staring at me. How was that possible? My room was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing that could allow someone to stand outside the window like that. Yet there it was, watching me. I blinked, and just like that, it was gone. The space outside my window was empty again, the street below quiet and undisturbed. My heart was still racing, and my skin prickled with unease, but I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the shadow had been nothing more than a passing cloud, and my tired mind had turned it into something more sinister. I closed the curtains, trying to push the image from my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The following nights, the tapping continued. Every evening, just as I was about to settle into bed, I would hear the soft, rhythmic tap, 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 tap against the glass. And every time I would look toward the window, expecting to see the shadowy figure again. But I never did. I told my parents about it after a few nights, but they didn't take me seriously. My dad shrugged it off, saying it was probably a branch or a bird. My mom told me I was just tired and that I needed to relax. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. Something had been outside my window that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. The tapping continued, always the same 3 soft knocks against the window, as if someone was trying to get my attention. It happened every night without fail, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel the same creeping dread whenever the sound started. Then, one night, everything changed. I had just gotten into bed, my curtains drawn tightly shut, hoping to block out whatever was making the noise. I had convinced myself that I wouldn't look, that I wouldn't acknowledge the tapping this time. But as soon as I turned off the light, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the sound was insistent, louder than it had been before. I pulled the covers over my head, my heart racing, as the tapping continued, more urgent now. And then, suddenly, it stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to return. But instead of the tapping, I heard something far worse. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but it grew louder, clearer, until I could make out the words. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. The voice was coming from just outside the window, soft and raspy, like someone was standing right there, inches away from the glass, whispering through the barrier between us. "Let me in." The words sent a chill down my spine. My body tensed, frozen in place, as the whispering continued. "Please let me in." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The voice was so close, so real, that I half expected to see the glass shatter as something forced its way inside. But the window remained intact, the only thing separating me from whatever was outside. "I won't hurt you, let me in." I wanted to scream, to run to my parents' room and tell them what was happening, but my voice was trapped in my throat. All I could do was lie there paralyzed with fear, as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in." I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours, I couldn't tell. But eventually, the whispering stopped. The tapping didn't return, and the night fell silent once more. I lay there, trembling, until the first light of dawn finally crept through the edges of the curtains. I didn't tell my parents about the voice. I knew they wouldn't believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed myself. The next day, I decided to investigate. I couldn't stand the idea of something watching me from outside my window, whispering to me in the dead of night. I had to know if there was some explanation, something that could put my mind at ease. After school, I went outside and walked around to the side of the house where my window was. As I stood there, looking up at the second-floor window, I realized how impossible it was for anyone to have been there. The wall was sheer, with no ledges, no balconies, nothing that could support the weight of a person. But then I noticed something strange. Just below the window, in the dirt, were footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the soft earth, but they were there. Large, deep prints, as if someone had been standing below my window, staring up at it for hours. My stomach churned with fear as I knelt down to examine the prints. They were too large to be mine, and they didn't belong to my parents either. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, as if whoever had made them had been there recently. I backed away, my heart pounding. Someone had been outside my window. Someone had been watching me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, my curtains drawn tightly, every muscle in my body tense as I waited for the tapping to start again. But it never did. For the next few days, the tapping stopped and the voice didn't return. I began to relax, thinking that maybe it was over. Maybe whoever or whatever had been outside my window had finally left. But then, one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something far worse than tapping or whispers. Footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, but as I listened, they grew louder, more distinct. Someone was walking outside my house, moving slowly, deliberately, as if searching for something. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening to the footsteps draw closer. They circled the house, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot, before finally stopping beneath my window. I held my breath, waiting, my entire body trembling with fear. And then I heard it. The whisper. "Let me in." The voice was right outside, closer than ever, as if the figure was standing just below the window, staring up at it, waiting for me to respond. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would go away, that it would leave me alone. But the voice continued, soft and insistent. "Let me in, I'm right here." Tears welled up in my eyes as the voice grew louder, more desperate. "Please let me in." I couldn't take it anymore. I threw off the covers and bolted out of bed, running down the hall to my parents' room. I burst through the door, shaking, barely able to speak, as I told them what I had heard. They followed me back to my room, their faces full of concern, but when they opened the curtains, there was nothing there. The street outside was empty, the night quiet and still. But I knew what I had heard. I knew someone had been outside my window. After that night, I never slept with the window open again. I kept the curtains drawn tightly, and I convinced my dad to install a lock on the window, even though he didn't believe there was any real threat. The tapping and the whispers stopped after that, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, something that wanted to get inside. Even now, years later, I still find myself glancing at my window before bed, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing outside, waiting for me. Because deep down, I know that whatever it was, it hasn't really gone away. It's still out there somewhere. Waiting. When something dark asks to come in, will you be brave enough to keep it out? What would you do if someone sought refuge in your home during a storm, but something about them wasn't quite right? The storm had been raging all evening, the wind howling through the trees and rain hammering against the windows with such force that it sounded like the sky itself was tearing apart. I was alone that night, nestled in the warmth of my house, grateful for the shelter as the world outside seemed to crumble under the weight of the storm. The power had gone out hours ago, and the only light in the house came from the soft glow of candles flickering in the dark. I wasn't scared, though. Storms had always been comforting to me in a strange way. There was something about the raw power of nature that made the quiet of my home feel even more peaceful, like I was in my own little world, safe from everything outside. That night, however, the storm brought something with it, something I never expected. It was late, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching the world outside in darkness. I had just settled onto the couch with a blanket, a book in my hand, when I heard it. A knock at the door. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the storm, but unmistakable. I froze, the book slipping from my fingers as I strained to listen. Who would be knocking at my door in the middle of a storm like this? The town I lived in was small, and my house was on the outskirts, far from any neighbors. No one ever came by unannounced, especially not during weather like this. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated, my heart beginning to race. It wasn't unusual for people to get stranded during storms, especially with the roads being as bad as they were. Maybe it was someone in need of help, a traveler who had lost their way, or someone whose car had broken down. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, a cold dread settled in my stomach. Whoever was outside, I didn't want to let them in. But I couldn't just leave someone out there in the storm. With a sigh, I stood up, wrapping the blanket tightly around my shoulders as I made my way to the front door. The wind howled louder as I approached, the sound of the rain nearly deafening as it pounded against the roof. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before turning it and pulling the door open. A man stood on my porch, drenched from head to toe, his clothes clinging to his body as the rain poured down around him. He was tall, his features obscured by the darkness and the hood of his jacket, but I could see the water dripping from his face, his breath coming in heavy gasps. He looked up at me, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of his eyes dark and hollow, like the storm itself had taken hold of him. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice rough and shaky. "My car broke down a few miles back. I was hoping I could use your phone to call for help." My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at him. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, nothing that should have made me so afraid. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he stood there, soaked and silent, that sent a chill down my spine. I glanced past him, looking out into the darkness beyond the porch, but there was nothing there. No car, no lights, just the endless storm swallowing the world outside. "Please," the man said again, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I won't stay long. I just need to make a call." I hesitated. Everything inside me screamed not to let him in, to shut the door and pretend I hadn't heard the knock. But how could I turn him away? He was stranded in the middle of a storm, soaked to the bone. If I didn't let him in, who knew how long he'd be out there? Reluctantly, I stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. He nodded his thanks and stepped over the threshold, dripping water onto the hardwood floor as he entered. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, muffling the roar of the storm outside. I handed him a towel from the linen closet near the door, watching as he dried his face and hands. He didn't speak for a moment, just stood there, catching his breath as the rain continued to pound against the roof. "The phone's in the kitchen," I said, my voice unsteady. "You can make your call from there." He nodded and followed me into the kitchen, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as he stepped into the dim light of the candle flickering on the counter. He reached for the phone, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted it to his ear. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, my body tense, waiting for something to happen. But he just stood there, the phone pressed to his ear, his face blank as he stared at the wall. I frowned, my stomach twisting with unease. Something wasn't right. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. The silence stretched on, the only sound the soft crackle of the candle's flame and the distant rumble of thunder. My skin prickled with dread as I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I said, "Is everything okay?" I repeated, my voice more insistent this time. Slowly, he turned to face me, the phone still held to his ear. His eyes were dark, empty, like a void that swallowed all light. A shiver ran down my spine as I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. "There's no one to call," he said, his voice low and cold. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What did he mean? Was his phone call not going through because of the storm? Or had he lied about needing to make a call in the first place? "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lowered the phone and placed it back on the counter, his eyes never leaving mine. The silence between us was deafening, and the fear that had been gnawing at me since I opened the door surged to the surface. I took a step back, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what was happening. "Maybe you should leave," I said, my voice firmer now, though it wavered with fear. "I'll call someone for you in the morning, but right now I think you should go." He didn't move. For a long moment, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. The air around us heavy with something unspoken. My heart raced, and I could feel the tension building, like the air before lightning strikes. Suddenly, he smiled. It was a slow, creeping smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. It made my skin crawl, every instinct inside me screaming to get away from him. "You're right," he said, his voice smooth now, almost amused. "I should go." Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the front door, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. I followed him, keeping my distance, my heart pounding in my ears. He reached the door and paused for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob. "Thank you for your hospitality," he said, his voice soft. "I'll see myself out." I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching as he opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The wind howled as it rushed inside, the rain splattering against the floor, but I didn't care. I just wanted him gone. The door closed behind him with a heavy thud, and I locked it, my hands trembling as I twisted the bolt into place. For a long time, I stood there in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with questions. Who was that man? And why had his presence made me feel so uneasy? I peeked through the curtains, expecting to see him walking down the driveway, but there was no sign of him. The rain poured down in thick sheets, obscuring my view of the street, but I could tell that he was gone. The street was empty, the storm the only thing left in the night. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world drenched and still. The sun was peeking through the clouds, casting a pale light over the wet streets. I didn't sleep much that night, my mind too unsettled by the strange encounter. I kept thinking about the man's hollow eyes, the way he had spoken as if he wasn't really looking for help, but for something else. I decided to go out and check the street, hoping to find some evidence of his car, the one he had claimed had broken down. Maybe seeing it would help settle my nerves, give me a rational explanation for the fear I had felt. But when I stepped outside, there was no car. The street was empty, just as it had been the night before. No tire tracks, no sign of anyone having been there at all. My stomach twisted with unease. Had he been lying about the car? If so, why had he come to my house in the middle of a storm? As I stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a neighbor came by, an older man who lived a few houses down. He waved at me and called out a greeting, his face friendly. "Some storm last night, huh?" he said, stopping by my yard. I nodded, still distracted by my thoughts. "Yeah," I replied. "Did you hear or see anything unusual last night? Maybe a man looking for help?" He frowned, shaking his head. "No, didn't see anyone. Just hunkered down inside until it passed." I hesitated, unsure of whether I should mention the stranger. Something about the whole situation felt off, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. "Well, thanks anyway," I said, offering a forced smile. The man nodded and continued on his way, leaving me standing there, more confused than ever. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I told myself that the man had been nothing more than a lost traveler, stranded in the storm and looking for help. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There had been something wrong about him, something that didn't make sense. I never saw him again, but every time it stormed, I found myself thinking about that night, wondering if he would come back, knocking on my door once more. And every time the wind howled, I couldn't help but feel that he was still out there somewhere, waiting for another storm. What if the next time the storm comes, the stranger knocks on your door again, would you let him in? What would you do if you discovered a room in your home that wasn't supposed to be there? I grew up in a house that my family had lived in for generations. It was a large, old Victorian home with creaky floors, tall ceilings, and more rooms than we knew what to do with. Every corner of the house held a story, each room filled with memories passed down from one generation to the next. It was a house that I loved, a house that felt like home until the day I discovered a room I had never seen before. I had always been curious about the hidden nooks and crannies of the house. As a child, I would explore every corner, from the dusty attic to the dark, musty basement. But no matter how many times I explored, I never found anything particularly unusual. That is, until I stumbled upon the room. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind of day where the world outside seemed too dreary to venture into, so I decided to spend my time cleaning the house. My parents were away for the weekend, and I was left alone in the sprawling house, tasked with making sure everything was in order. I started in the upstairs hallway, dusting the old picture frames that lined the walls and sweeping the wooden floor. The house was quiet, save for the steady patter of rain against the windows. It was peaceful, almost soothing, as I moved from room to room, checking to see if anything needed tidying. I had just finished dusting the bookshelves in one of the guest rooms when I noticed something strange. There was a door at the far end of the hallway, a door I had never seen before. At first, I thought I was mistaken. I had lived in this house my entire life. I knew every inch of it, every door, every room. But this door was unfamiliar. It was tucked away in the shadows at the end of the hall, partially obscured by an old tapestry that hung on the wall. I stared at it, my heart skipping a beat. How had I never noticed it before? I set down my cleaning supplies and walked toward the door. My curiosity piqued. It was small, almost hidden, and the wood was faded with age, as if it had been there for a very long time. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob, a strange feeling settling over me like I wasn't supposed to open it. But I couldn't resist. The doorknob was cold and stiff as I turned it, the hinges creaking in protest as the door slowly swung open. A gust of cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond, sending a shiver down my spine. The room was small, barely more than a closet, with walls that were cracked and peeling. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. A thick layer of dust coated the floor, and the air inside was stale, musty, like the room had been sealed off from the rest of the house for a very long time. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the tiny space. There wasn't much to see: a single, broken chair in the corner, a small window covered in grime, an old, faded wallpaper that had begun to peel away from the walls. But something about the room felt wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the room was holding on to something dark and forgotten. As I stood there, taking it all in, I noticed something strange on the floor: faint scratches, barely visible under the dust, leading from the door to the far corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down, running my fingers over the marks. They were deep, uneven, as if someone had dragged something, as if someone had been dragged across the floor. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. I had never heard anything about this room before. My parents had never mentioned it, and there was no reason for a room like this to exist, hidden away at the end of the hallway. What had happened here? The unease in my chest grew stronger, and I decided it was time to leave. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, but as soon as the door clicked shut, I felt a strange sense of relief, like the house itself was glad I had left the room. I tried to push the discovery from my mind, telling myself it was just an old storage room that had been forgotten over the years. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the scratches on the floor, the cold air, the sense of dread that had washed over me the moment I stepped inside. There was something wrong with that room, and deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I decided to confront my parents about the room. I called my mom, hoping she would have some explanation. Maybe it was just an old storage space, or maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But when I mentioned the room, my mom went silent. "What room?" she asked, her voice tense. I frowned, confused by her reaction. "The small room at the end of the upstairs hallway," I said. "It's hidden behind that tapestry." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when my mom spoke again, her voice was strained. "There's no room at the end of the hallway," she said. "What are you talking about?" A chill ran down my spine. I knew what I had seen. I had opened the door, stepped inside, felt the cold air, and seen the scratches on the floor. But my mom was acting like the room didn't exist. I didn't know what to say, so I ended the conversation, telling her I must have been mistaken. But I wasn't mistaken. I knew that room was real. Later that day, I returned to the hallway, determined to find some explanation for what I had seen. But when I reached the end of the hall, I froze. The door was gone. The tapestry still hung on the wall. But the door I had opened just the day before was no longer there. It was as if it had never existed. My heart raced as I ran my hands over the wall, searching for any sign of the door. But there was nothing, just solid wood paneling where the door had once been. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. How was that possible? I had seen the room. I had stood inside it. How could it just disappear? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the room, the dusty floor, the broken chair, the scratches. I tossed and turned, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me, but it was no use. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and decided to get a glass of water. The house was dark and silent as I made my way down the stairs, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint tapping sound coming from the hallway upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was soft, rhythmic, like someone knocking gently on a door. The door. I slowly turned and made my way back up the stairs, each step heavy with fear. The tapping grew louder as I reached the top of the stairs, echoing through the empty hallway. I stood at the end of the hallway, staring at the spot where the door had been. The tapping continued, faint but insistent, coming from the other side of the wall. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pressed it against the wall. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, my heart racing, waiting for something to happen. But the hallway was silent again. I didn't know what to do. The room, whatever it was, had disappeared, but something was still there, hidden behind the wall. I could feel it, lurking just out of reach, waiting for me to find it again. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a dream, that the room had never existed in the first place. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the memories of the room haunted me. I kept hearing the tapping at night, soft and rhythmic, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. One evening, I decided to go back to the hallway one last time. I needed to know if the room was real, if what I had seen was just my imagination. I waited until it was dark, the house quiet, and then I made my way upstairs. When I reached the end of the hallway, I stopped. The door was back. It was exactly where it had been before, hidden behind the tapestry, as if it had never disappeared. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it, my hands trembling. I didn't want to open it again. I didn't want to see what was inside, but I had to know. With a deep breath, I reached for the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open, revealing the small, dusty room. It looked exactly the same as before: the broken chair in the corner, the peeling wallpaper, the faint scratches on the floor. But this time, there was something else. In the far corner of the room, hidden in the shadows, was a small wooden chest. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat as I approached the chest. It was old, covered in dust, the wood dark and worn with age. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I reached for the lid. It creaked as I lifted it, the hinges stiff with disuse. Inside there was nothing but a single, folded piece of paper. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and the words written on it were faint, barely legible. But I could make them out. Do not open the door. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what it meant or why it was in the chest, but I knew one thing for certain. I should never have opened the door. When you find a door that's not supposed to exist, do you dare open it? What would you do if the reflection staring back at you wasn't your own? It was supposed to be an ordinary summer, the kind of lazy break between semesters where you slept in late, spent time with friends, and tried not to think too much about the next school year. My parents had rented a cabin for us deep in the woods, far from any city noise, for a much-needed family vacation. I was looking forward to the peace and quiet, but what I found in that cabin changed everything. The cabin itself was small but charming, with dark wooden walls and large windows that looked out into the thick trees surrounding us. It was the kind of place where the sounds of the forest became part of the silent birds calling out in the distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was isolated, just the way we liked it. I remember feeling excited as we settled in, unpacking our bags and exploring the cabin. My room was at the back of the house, a cozy space with a large window that let in the early evening light. There wasn't much in the room, just a bed, a dresser, and a large mirror that hung on the wall beside the door. The mirror was old, its surface slightly tarnished, with an ornate wooden frame carved with intricate designs. From the moment I saw that mirror, something about it unsettled me. At first, I thought it was just because it was old. The mirror's surface was cloudy, and the reflection it gave off was warped, making my room look darker and more cramped than it actually was. But there was something else too. Something about the way the mirror seemed to pull me in, like it was watching me even when I wasn't looking at it. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was just a mirror, after all. There was nothing to be afraid of. But things changed quickly after that first night. The first incident happened just after sunset. I was lying on the bed, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. The mirror, which was positioned across from the bed, seemed to shift, as if the reflection inside it was moving. I frowned and glanced up, my heart skipping a beat as I stared at the glass. Everything in the reflection looked normal: the bed, the dresser, the window behind me. But as I looked closer, I realized something wasn't right. The reflection wasn't quite in sync with my movements. When I shifted on the bed, the reflection in the mirror lagged behind, just by a second, but enough to make my stomach twist with unease. It was as if the person in the mirror wasn't me, but someone pretending to be me, someone who wasn't quite getting it right. I stood up slowly, my eyes locked on the mirror, and walked toward it. My reflection followed, but again, there was a delay, a split second, where the person in the mirror hesitated before copying my movements. I raised my hand, and the reflection did the same, but it felt wrong, unnatural, like it wasn't me looking back at myself. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the old mirror, the warped glass causing some kind of optical illusion. But the feeling of unease stayed with me as I turned away and left the room. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the reflection in the mirror, moving just a fraction of a second too late, watching me even when I wasn't looking at it. The next morning, I tried to forget about the mirror. I spent most of the day outside with my parents, hiking through the woods and enjoying the fresh air. The sun was bright, the sky a perfect blue, and for a few hours, I felt like everything was normal again. But when I returned to the cabin that evening, the unease came rushing back. I was alone in my room, getting ready for bed, when I caught sight of the mirror again. It was hard to avoid. It was so large and positioned in such a way that it reflected nearly the entire room. I couldn't help but glance at it, even though I didn't want to. That's when I saw it. In the reflection, standing in the doorway behind me, was a face. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the shadows, but it was there. A face pale thin, with wide, hollow eyes staring back at me from the darkness of the hallway. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there, just the quiet creak of the floorboards and the distant rustle of the wind outside. My chest tightened with fear as I turned back to the mirror, half expecting the face to still be there. But when I looked again, it was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my pulse racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. It had been so quick, so faint, that I could almost convince myself it was a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen it. Someone or something had been watching me. The following nights were worse. Every time I looked in the mirror, I felt like something was watching me from the other side. It wasn't just my reflection anymore. There was something else, something lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the mirror, too afraid to look away. I kept expecting to see the face again, to see the eyes staring back at me from the shadows. And sometimes I thought I did. Just a flash, a glimpse of something pale and hollow, gone as quickly as it appeared. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. They brushed it off as an overactive imagination, saying I was just spooking myself out because of the cabin's isolation. My mom even suggested covering the mirror with a blanket if it bothered me that much. But I knew it wasn't just in my head. I knew there was something wrong with the mirror. One night, things escalated. I had been trying to avoid looking at the mirror as much as possible, but that night, something drew me to it. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to stand in front of it, to confront whatever was lurking behind the glass. I stood there, staring at my reflection, waiting. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection mimicked my movements, perfectly in sync, just as it should. But then, slowly, the reflection began to change. The edges of the glass seemed to warp, the image growing distorted and dark. My reflection's my eyes began to shift, growing wider, darker, until they were just hollow voids staring back at me. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat, but the reflection didn't move. It stood there, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes, as if it had finally broken free from the constraints of the mirror. The corners of its mouth twitched, slowly curling into a smile cold and lifeless. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection, saw its eyes, its smile, burned into my mind. The next day, I told my parents I wanted to leave the cabin early. I couldn't explain why, not without sounding crazy, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The mirror had changed, or maybe it had always been different, and I had just never noticed. Whatever the case, I couldn't bear to be in the same room with it anymore. My parents, though confused, agreed to cut the vacation short. I packed my bags as quickly as I could, not daring to glance at the mirror again. But as I left the room for the final time, I couldn't help but take one last look. The reflection was normal again, just a mirror reflecting the room as it should. But even then, I knew the truth. The mirror wasn't normal. Something was inside it, something dark and malicious, waiting for someone to see it. As we drove away from the cabin, I felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering fear that the mirror and whatever was inside it wasn't done with me. For weeks after we returned home, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. The image of my reflection distorted, smiling, hollow-eyed haunted me, replaying in my mind every time I looked at my own reflection. I started avoiding mirrors altogether. I couldn't stand the sight of my own reflection, terrified that one day I'd see that same twisted version of myself staring back at me. But it wasn't just mirrors that unsettled me. It was anything reflective windows, puddles, even shiny surfaces. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, following me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I glanced up at the mirror above the sink. My heart skipped a beat. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection moved as it should, brushing its teeth in time with me. But as I leaned closer, I saw it just for a split second, my reflection's eyes, hollow and dark, staring back at me. And then it smiled. I dropped the toothbrush, my body trembling with fear, and stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My reflection, it wasn't mine anymore. Whatever had been in that mirror at the cabin had followed me home. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never look in a mirror the same way again. When your reflection stops being your own, can you trust what's looking back at you? What would you do if the house you lived in started speaking to you, but not in words you wanted to hear? When my family moved into the old house on Elm Street, it felt like the perfect place to start over. We had been through a tough few years, and this house, with its large rooms, charming details, and spacious yard, felt like a fresh start. My parents were thrilled, and even I, usually skeptical of old houses, couldn't help but feel a little excited about the change. The house had been built in the early 1900s, and it had that sense of history clinging to it. The wood-paneled walls, the antique fixtures, and the creaky floorboards all spoke of a time long past, when people lived slower, simpler lives. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was something about it that felt off. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer in the corners of the rooms, or the way the house groaned and shifted at night, as if it was settling into itself. Or maybe it was just the sense that the house had been waiting for someone, waiting for us. I tried to push those thoughts aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, it was an old house, of course it was going to creak and groan. That was just part of its charm, right? But then the whispers started. It began on our second night in the house. I had been up late unpacking, trying to get my room in order before the start of the new school year. The rest of the house was quiet, my parents already asleep down the hall. I was exhausted, but determined to finish at least one box before bed. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone was murmuring just beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it was just the wind. The old house had plenty of drafts, and the breeze outside had been picking up. But as I sat there, straining to listen, the whisper came again, low, faint, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was coming from the floor beneath me, as if someone or something was down there, speaking in a voice too quiet to understand. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the hardwood floor. The whisper was still there, but it was impossible to make out the words. It was like listening to a conversation through a wall, muffled, distant, but undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly stood up, backing away from the spot on the floor where I had heard the whisper. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the old pipes or the wind seeping through the cracks in the house. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was whispering from beneath the floorboards. The next morning, I tried to brush off the experience. I told myself I was just tired from the move, and that I had probably imagined the whole thing. But as the days passed, the whispers didn't stop. They were always faint, just on the edge of my hearing, like someone speaking just out of reach. They would come at random times when I was lying in bed at night, or when I was alone in the house during the day. Always the same low, murmured voices, just beneath the floor. I tried to ignore them at first, hoping they would go away on their own. But the more I ignored them, the louder they seemed to get. It was like the house was trying to get my attention, trying to make me listen. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispering grew louder. It was still muffled, still impossible to understand, but it was more insistent, more urgent than before. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were multiple voices now, all murmuring together, overlapping in a confusing, incoherent chorus. I could feel my skin crawl as I threw off the covers and got out of bed, determined to find the source of the sound. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs to the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The whispering grew louder as I reached the bottom of the stairs, echoing up from beneath the floor. My pulse quickened as I walked across the living room, shining the flashlight around the room, trying to find where the sound was coming from. Then I heard it clearer this time. A single word, rising above the murmur of the other voices. Listen. I froze, my blood running cold. The word was soft, but unmistakable. Someone or something was speaking to me. I knelt down on the floor, pressing my ear to the wood. The whispering continued, the voices overlapping, growing louder, more desperate. Listen, listen. Listen. I jumped up, backing away from the spot on the floor. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't my imagination. The voices were real. The house was speaking to me. But what did it want? The next morning, I told my parents about the whispers. I expected them to laugh it off, to tell me I was just hearing things because of the old house. But to my surprise, they didn't. My mom's face grew pale as I spoke, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her coffee cup. I heard them too, she said quietly. I stared at her, my heart skipping a beat. What do you mean? She looked away, her expression tight. Last night I thought I heard voices. I thought it was just a dream, but... My dad didn't say anything, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He didn't want to admit it, but I could tell he had heard them too. We spent the rest of the day in a tense silence, none of us willing to talk about the whispers. But the truth hung heavy in the air. We weren't alone in this house. That night, the whispers were louder than ever. They started as soon as the sun went down, echoing up from the floorboards in every room of the house. I tried to drown them out, turning up the TV and covering my ears with my pillow, but it was no use. The voices were persistent, growing louder and more urgent with every passing minute. It wasn't long before I could make out more words faint, but clear enough to send chills down my spine. Help us. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The voices were pleading, begging for something. I didn't know what, but I could feel their desperation, their fear. I got out of bed, grabbing my flashlight again, and made my way downstairs. The whispering followed me, growing louder as I reached the living room. The floor creaked under my feet as I knelt down, shining the flashlight on the wood. The voices were right beneath me now, so close I could almost feel them. Help us. Without thinking, I began pulling at the floorboards, prying them up one by one. My hands trembled as I worked, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't stop myself. The voices were calling to me, guiding me. As I pulled up the last floorboard, the whispering stopped. Beneath the floor, There was nothing but dirt and dust. No hidden crawl space, no secret compartment, just the cold, damp earth beneath the house. But as I shone the flashlight across the dirt, something caught my eye. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but there etched into the dirt was a symbol, a circle surrounded by strange markings, like something carved by a hand long gone. My stomach churned as I stared at the symbol, a deep sense of dread settling over me. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't name. And then, from the darkness below, the whispering started again. Free us. The next morning, I didn't tell my parents what I had found. I couldn't. They were already on edge, and I didn't want to make things worse. But the symbol in the dirt haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about what it meant and about the voices that had led me to it. I spent hours researching symbols and rituals, trying to find anything that matched the markings I had seen. But nothing I found made sense. The symbols were ancient, older than any record I could find, and they seemed to be linked to something far darker than I could have imagined. That night, as I lay in bed, the whispering returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from beneath the floor. It was coming from the walls. The voices were louder now, clearer, as if they had moved closer. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, real and desperate, calling out to me. Free us. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, the voices rising and falling in a haunting rhythm. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in on me from all sides. I ran from my room, my heart pounding in my chest. But the voices followed. They echoed through the hallway, through the living room, through the entire house. Free us. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was here, whatever had been trapped beneath the floor for all these years, was trying to escape. And I couldn't be the one to let it out. We moved out of the house a week later. My parents never asked why I was so desperate to leave, and I never told them about the symbol I had found beneath the floorboards. But I could see the relief in their faces when we finally packed up and left. We never spoke about the whispers again, but sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I still hear them. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Free us. Kate, when the voices start calling from beneath your feet, will you listen? What would you do if something forgotten and lifeless suddenly came back to haunt you? My family's house had an attic that I had never been particularly fond of. It wasn't the kind of attic you'd see in movies, filled with exciting old treasures or long-lost family heirlooms. Instead, it was dusty, cramped, and full of boxes stacked so high that it felt more like a labyrinth of forgotten junk than a storage space. As a kid, I avoided the attic whenever I could. There was something about it that always unsettled me, the way the floorboards creaked beneath my feet, the musty smell that hung in the air, and the dim, flickering light bulb that barely illuminated the space. Even when my parents would send me up there to grab a box or some old decorations, I would rush in and out as quickly as possible, eager to get away from the eerie stillness that seemed to linger there. It wasn't until I was much older, when I returned home for a summer break from college, that I had any reason to spend significant time in the attic again. My parents had asked me to help clean it out, to finally sort through the mountains of old boxes and decide what could be thrown away. Reluctantly, I agreed. The first few days of cleaning were uneventful. Most of the boxes were filled with old clothes, forgotten toys, and random household items that had no real value. I found myself sifting through piles of stuff, tossing out anything that was broken or unnecessary, and keeping only a few things that had sentimental value. But then, on the third day, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. In one of the far corners of the attic, buried beneath a pile of dusty blankets, I uncovered an old wooden chest. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate carvings etched into the wood. The chest was locked, and I had no idea where the key might be, but something about it intrigued me. It didn't look like anything I had seen before in our house. Curiosity got the best of me, and I carried the chest down to the living room. My dad had a set of old keys that he kept in his office, and after some searching, I found one that fit the lock. With a satisfying click, the chest opened. Inside, nestled among layers of faded tissue paper, was a doll. It was a small porcelain doll, no bigger than my hand. Its face was delicate, with painted blue eyes, rosy cheeks, and dark brown hair styled in tight curls. The doll wore a lace dress, yellowed with age, and its tiny hands were positioned as though it had once been holding something that was now missing. For a moment, I just stared at the doll, unsure of what to make of it. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong with the rest of the things in the attic. I couldn't recall ever seeing it before, and I had no memory of my parents mentioning it. When my mom came home that evening, I showed her the doll, hoping she might know where it came from, but when she saw it, her face went pale. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice tight. "It was in the attic," I replied, confused by her reaction. "In an old chest. Do you know whose it was?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "It was mine," she said quietly. "When I was a little girl." I frowned. My mom had never mentioned having a doll like this before. Why was it in the attic? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, gingerly picking up the doll as if it might break in her hands. "I didn't think we still had it," she said softly, almost to herself. "I thought we got rid of it years ago." "Why would you want to get rid of it?" I asked, still puzzled. "It's just a doll, right?" My mom's eyes darkened as she set the doll back down in the chest. "There's something wrong with it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. My mom's reaction had unnerved me, and the more I thought about it, the more I wondered why she had been so eager to get rid of it. It was just a porcelain doll, old and fragile, but nothing more than a childhood toy. Or so I thought. The next day, while my parents were out, I went back to the chest. The doll was still there, lying on its bed of tissue paper, its painted blue eyes staring up at me. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up, running my fingers over the smooth porcelain of its face. As I held the doll, a strange feeling washed over me. It was subtle at first, like a faint tingling in my hands, but it quickly grew stronger, a sense of discomfort, of wrongness, as if the doll was too heavy for its size, like it was more than just porcelain and lace. I set the doll down, my heart pounding. What was it about this doll that made me feel so uneasy? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive, thick with something I couldn't name. I tossed and turned, trying to push the doll from my mind, but sleep wouldn't come. And then, in the middle of the night, I heard it. A soft thud coming from the attic above me. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like something had been knocked over, or something had moved on its own. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe one of the boxes had fallen over, or maybe it was just the house settling. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in the attic. The next morning, I was determined to figure out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up to the attic, my hands trembling as I climbed the narrow staircase. The attic was just as I had left it, boxes piled high, dust covering every surface, but something felt different. The air was colder, heavier, and the silence that had once seemed comforting now felt suffocating. I walked over to the corner where I had found the chest, my heart pounding in my ears. The doll was still inside, lying on its bed of tissue paper, just as I had left it. But something was wrong. The doll's face, once delicate and serene, had changed. Its painted blue eyes were now wide and staring, its lips pulled back into a grotesque smile that hadn't been there before. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The doll's expression, it was different. I was sure of it. I slammed the chest shut, my hands shaking as I locked it and shoved it back into the corner. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't keep the doll in the house any longer. There was something wrong with it, something that had been lurking in the shadows of the attic for years. That evening, I told my parents what had happened. My mom listened quietly, her face growing pale as I described the changes in the doll's expression. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "I told you," she said softly. "There's something wrong with that doll." She didn't explain further, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't need to say anything more. I knew, without a doubt, that the doll was dangerous. The next day, we packed up the doll, chest and all, and took it to the local thrift store. I didn't care what happened to it, I just wanted it out of the house. My mom agreed, saying it was time to finally let go of whatever memories were tied to the doll. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. The doll was gone, and the strange occurrences in the attic stopped. The house felt normal again, and I was able to sleep without that heavy, oppressive feeling hanging over me. But then, 2 weeks later, I got a phone call. It was the thrift store, asking if I could come down to pick up an item I had donated. Confused, I asked what they meant. "The chest," the woman on the phone said, "with the doll inside. It was returned to us. There was no name, no explanation, just left on our doorstep last night." My blood ran cold. The doll had come back. When I arrived at the thrift store, the chest was sitting behind the counter, just as I had left it. The woman who had called me looked uneasy as she handed it over, her eyes flicking nervously to the locked chest. "Is there something wrong with it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that the doll inside wasn't just a toy, but something far darker, something that had followed me even after I tried to get rid of it? I took the chest home, my hands trembling as I set it down on the kitchen table. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see the doll again, but I knew I had to. With a deep breath, I unlocked the chest and lifted the lid. The doll was still there, its painted blue eyes staring up at me. But this time, the smile on its face was even wider, more sinister. It was as if the doll knew I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I slammed the lid shut, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. The doll had come back, and I had no idea how to get rid of it for good. That night, the thudding in the attic returned, louder than ever. I could hear it clearly from my bedroom, each soft thud sending a shiver down my spine. The doll was still in the chest downstairs, but I knew it was responsible. I could feel its presence, watching me from the shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the thudding grow louder, more insistent. The doll wanted something, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it away. When something lifeless comes to life, can you ever escape its grip?